Today's lecture will cover a brief history of virtual environments as an aesthetic endeavor, as well as the technological timeline. But before we get to that history, I want to discuss what we mean when I use the term virtual environment. For our purposes, I would like to define virtual environments as representations of spatial dimensions that do not physically exist in actuality, but are perceived as such. In this sense, the most common contemporary example of virtual environments are computer-generated 3D virtual spaces. However, this definition is broad enough to also include spatial representations that are not necessarily computer-generated. Importantly, however, this definition does differentiate virtual environments from other related phenomena. For example, for our purposes, we will not consider virtual environments as encompassing spaces that are conjured through dreaming or induced through the use of narcotics. Furthermore, environments that exist solely as mental phenomena, such as a space that can be imagined in one's mind, perhaps inspired by a particularly good book. These spaces are conceptually similar to virtual spaces or virtual environments, but falls outside of our definition. In some ways, however, I do think it is productive to leave our definition somewhat ambiguous. Do photographs count as a virtual environment? What about photorealistic painting? What about first-person video games? In our definition, the perception of the environment is doing a lot of heavy lifting and gives our definition a slipperiness that provides a starting point for our investigations into this concept. One way to think about how virtual environments are perceived is to consider the way these spaces induce the illusion of existing in actuality to create the perception of being immersed within that environment. The power of this illusion exists on a spectrum. While a large framed photograph might induce a sense of being inside or immersed in that image, this sense of immersion is less intense when compared to something like an IMAX film. Currently, the most extreme example of this sense of immersion are the virtual environments presented through virtual reality head-mounted displays. To some, virtual reality is viewed as a totally new phenomenon. However, the idea of installing an observer in a hermetically closed-off image space of illusion did not make its first appearance with the technical invention of computer-aided virtual realities. On the contrary, virtual reality forms part of the core of the relationship of humans to images. It is grounded in art traditions that, in the course of history, suffered ruptures and discontinuities, were subject to the specific media of their epoch, and used to transport content of a highly disparate nature. Yet the idea goes back at least as far as the classical world, and it now reappears in the immersion strategies of present-day virtual art. Some have pointed out that the concept of virtual reality can be traced back to Plato's famous allegory of the cave. In this allegory, Plato asks us to imagine a cave with a strong light source, perhaps a large fire or the sun, shining in through the cave's opening. Inside the cave, a number of prisoners are chained, and they've been there since birth. And they are chained such that they could only face the back wall of the cave. Plato argues that the shadows cast by objects moving past the cave's opening become reality for the cave's prisoners. It is only when one of the prisoners manages to escape that they realize that the true nature of reality lies beyond what they experience inside the cave. In this sense, Plato's allegory imagines a virtual environment that appears real to those that inhabit it, but is, in fact, simply a very powerful illusion. Clearly, over the course of history, there are a number of examples of people who had proposed some form of virtual environment. Richard Wagner's concept of Gesamtkunstwerk and Frederick Kiesler's never realized film arts guild cinema come to mind. But for the purposes of this lecture, I think it'd be more useful to consider a few historical examples of immersive virtual spaces that were actualized. Doing so will help us ground our consideration of practices in contemporary immersive media art. In his book, Virtual Art From Illusion to Immersion, media theorist Oliver Grau traces many historical examples of immersive spaces of illusion, of which I will discuss 3. The Casa dei Misteri from 60 BC, the Sala delle Prospettive from 1516, and Robert Barker's Edinburgh panorama built in 1788. In the second Pompeian style of late Republican Rome, there were wall paintings that extended the room through representations of views into other spaces. A particularly forceful example is shown in one of the most famous frescoes of antiquity, the Villa Item, the so-called Casa dei Misteri at Pompeii, which dates from 60 BC. The audience finds itself amidst a series of life-sized, highly realistic figures. Some appeal directly to the recipient, others communicate with each other from wall to wall across the real space. The borders between visual and actual space seem to dissolve as the figures apparently move in real space. Visitors are trapped in the gaze of the figures, which hit from all sides and do not let go. The illusionary space surrounds the spectators entirely, fixing them into the same place and time. It is thought by some that the fresco depicts the initiation of a young woman into a Dionysian cult. The room may have been used for just such a ritual. Grau states, quote, "The image is a portal through which, in one direction, the gods pass into the real world, and in the other, real people enter into the image. The frieze bears witness to a virtual reality meant to encourage an emotional, ecstatic participation through the use of such suggestive visual means as totality of representation, choice of color, and dramatic gesture, thereby creating a fusion of audience and image and cult. The shining red vehemently projects a sensuous atmosphere, climaxing in a sexual initiation ritual which draws the viewer inexorably into the image. This type of painting achieves the maximum potential available to the medium of the fresco in antiquity." During the Renaissance, illusionistic spaces were in great demand. The Villa Barbaro in Macer, or the virtual pilgrimage at the Sacro Monte near Varallo, are just 2 outstanding examples. The most remarkable of these 360-degree spaces is the Sala delle Prospettive, created between 1516 and 1518 by Baldassare Peruzzi on behalf of Agostino Chigi in the Villa Farnasini in Rome. Chigi was a nouveau riche, desperate to secure his reputation and name largely by means of obsessive patronage. Peruzzi encircled the audience with the fresco of a virtual columned hall, painted in perspective, that offered illusionistic views of Rome and its surrounding countryside. The view of the landscape contrasts with the monumentality of the illusionistic temple hall. The splendid isolation of this architecture creates a feeling of the sublime, matched only by the view from a mountaintop, here resembling an imaginary Mount Olympus, from the top of which the visitor is surveying the skyline of contemporary Rome. In England, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, the new image machine, the panorama, achieved hitherto unknown dimensions of illusionary effect. With the financial help of Lord Elcho, Robert Barker realized his 1787 patented invention in the guards room of Holyrood Palace at Edinburgh. In the panorama, the audience is immediately surrounded on all sides by a 3-dimensional interior, a faux terrain which is imperceptibly connected to the 2-dimensional visual action and often makes the visual frontier untraceable. Because of the magical luminosity of the images, which comes from a hidden source of light, the visual space itself appears to be a source of reality. This representation of nature gives the vision totality and creates a sense of journeying through space and time, a complete universe of illusion. In a manner reminiscent of modern fears of simulator sickness, The panorama was criticized mainly for psychological reasons. It was argued that the illusion could result in an inability to perceive reality. Nevertheless, the mass media panorama spread successfully, with at least 100 million people visiting the 300 to 400 panoramic rotundas in Europe and America between 1870 and 1900 alone, making this medium a focal point of pictorial art in the industrial era. So those are just 3 examples of virtual spaces created throughout history. These examples demonstrate that the urge toward creating immersive virtual environments to bring spectators into the image is not particularly novel or specific to our contemporary media landscape. That said, when the genealogy of VR is considered from a technological viewpoint, our current instantiation of VR represents the culmination of a long lineage of specific technological innovations. These include stereoscopy, the head-mounted display, head tracking, gestural tracking, and 3D computer graphics. In 1838, English scientist and inventor Sir Charles Wheatstone wrote a paper in which he described a device he called a stereoscope. The stereoscope generated the illusion of depth from 2-dimensional images by taking advantage of the physiology of binocular vision. In human vision, depth can be perceived due to the offset created by the distance between the 2 eyes. Wheatstone's stereoscope took advantage of this fact by presenting 2 similar images slightly offset from one another to both eyes simultaneously. In doing so, the 2 images were perceived as a single image that appeared to have depth. Wheatstone would create a table-sized device he called the stereoscope to demonstrate this effect. It used 2 mirrors angled at 45 degrees to reflect images positioned on either side of the viewer. Sir David Brewster, another English scientist and inventor of the kaleidoscope in 1815, would miniaturize Wheatstone's stereoscope, creating a device with a form factor closer to that of a pair of binoculars. Brewster would bring his smaller stereoscope to the Great Exposition at Crystal Palace in 1851, where Queen Victoria herself would remark on its novelty. Due to the Queen's praise, stereoscopes would become immensely popular, and by the 1860s, stereoscopes were all the rage across Europe and the US. In 1861, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, an American physician and poet, would create a version of the stereoscope that was cheaper and easier to manufacture. His intentional decision to not patent his version resulted in a boom in the manufacturing of stereoscopes, making them a truly mass medium and allowing them to find their way into homes and schools around the world. From 1850 until around 1910, when radio became the dominant form of media, the stereoscope was the dominant form of image-based media consumption. Some other landmarks in the development of VR technology include the invention of the head-mounted display by Lieutenant Tom Furness in 1966. Due to the lack of space in the cockpit for a fighter jet, Furness created a head-mounted display to allow Air Force pilots to access dynamic information without taking up room inside the jet. 1 year later, a computer scientist by the name of Ivan Sutherland would create the first virtual reality head-mounted display. This device tracked the user's head movement to update images displayed to the user in real time. Sutherland would name this device the Sword of Damocles due to the fact that it had to be suspended from the ceiling above the user since it was too heavy to be worn comfortably on its own. Over the following decades, a number of research projects funded by educational institutions and the military would be created that eventually led to VR as we know it today. For example, in 1977, Daniel Sandin and Thomas DeFanti at the Electronic Visualization Laboratory a cross-disciplinary research lab at the University of Illinois at Chicago, created the Sayer glove, the first data glove. An inexpensive, lightweight glove to track hand gestures and monitor hand movement, the Sayer glove provided an effective method for multi-dimensional control. In 1985, Jaron Lanier and Thomas Zimmerman founded VPL Research Incorporated, the first company to sell VR headsets and gloves commercially. 2 years later, Lanier would popularize the term virtual reality. The 1990s saw the rapid evolution of 3D computer graphics, aided by the release of Autodesk's 3D Studio in 1990. Although CAD software had been around since the 1960s, and computer-generated 3D animation had been used in the film industry throughout the 1980s, it was during the last decade of the 20th century that 3D computer graphics took off, largely driven by the burgeoning gaming industry. The hardware and software developed during this time was instrumental in the design and delivery of the 3D virtual environments experienced in VR. In 2010, an 18-year-old entrepreneur named Palmer Luckey created the first prototype of the Oculus Rift VR headset. 2 years later, he would launch a successful Kickstarter campaign that would raise $2.4 million. And by 2014, Oculus would be bought out by Facebook for $2 billion, further accelerating the development of VR technology. Today, VR is a $16 billion industry that is rapidly growing. Tech giants such as Facebook, Microsoft, Sony, Apple, Samsung, and HTC, among others, continue to evolve VR hardware and software. While consumer demand for VR is relatively small compared to other tech platforms such as mobile devices, there are some who believe that VR, along with its related technology, augmented reality or AR, will eventually become the dominant media platform.